Saying we're going to define our rights ourselves and implement them, but it's relying on Crown approval and discretion to do that.
Tonight, the minister says the incoming rights recognition legislation will bring self-determination, but at a forum in Ottawa, chiefs aren't buying it.
There's a lot of work to be done to all the damage that has been done in the last 50 years.
Knowledge keepers speak their truth on day 2 of the National Inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
I'm surprised how readily available people are to spew that kind of hatred. And it's unfortunate, but it's happening in Canada.
And a glimpse of the discussion around the series premiere tonight of First Contact. Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Dennis Ward.
And I'm Melissa Ridgen. The Minister of Crown and Indigenous Relations, Carolyn Bennett, spoke to chiefs today at a special forum hosted by the Assembly of First Nations dealing with rights. The main subject of her speech was recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights framework.
It's legislation being proposed by the Trudeau government that it says will put Indigenous rights into law. But there are many skeptics who don't trust what the government is doing. As APTN's Justin Brake reports, Bennett was doing her best to calm those fears.
Carolyn Bennett spent her time at the forum assuring chiefs that Canada's framework will not water down or terminate Indigenous rights.
The framework will remove barriers for Indigenous people to support their self-determination aspiration through both law and policy. It'll support a distinctions-based approach for First Nations, Inuit and Métis, advance the implementation of treaties and agreements, support new approaches to the evolution of treaties and agreements, and keep the Government of Canada accountable.
Despite the reassurances, chiefs and AFN delegates were skeptical. Some took aim at the government's consultation process.
The government's dictating how this is going to happen. You know, the framework and the questions, they're coming from you. They're not coming from us. So I just have to state that because I heard time and time again, well, government needs to get out of the way. Get out of the way.
Others pointed out the disparities between Canada's promises and their own experiences.
My people, are right now being violated by, Canadian law, not even being followed. So I have a hard time buying it right now, Carolyn.
Somewhere down the line, we need to start talking. Not according to your rules, according to ours.
Tommy Monius, chief of Pimachikamak Cree Nation in Manitoba, says Canada refuses to recognize his community's form of governance. Another example of how their avowed respect for self-determination and sovereignty falls flat.
We've been here for thousands and thousands of years. So sovereignty to us is very important how we move this forward. And so Canada can understand that. We are not want to be backers in our own land anymore.
Niskonlith Secwepemc Chief Judy Wilson has been fighting the Trudeau government over the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. She says Canada isn't respecting inherent rights and title in the framework planning or on the ground.
They're saying we're going to define our rights ourselves and implement them, but it's relying on Crown approval and discretion to do that. And many of the nations are saying we do not need your approval to exercise our recognition and our rights and our title, and we're sovereign. And I think that's where the basis is going back to, is our inherent title and rights and our sovereignty. Canada still isn't acknowledging that.
The AFN forum concludes tomorrow. Delegates will meet again in December. Bennett says the government wants to table the framework by Christmas. If they have any hope of achieving that, they have a lot of work to do in the meantime. Justin Brake, APTN National News, Gatineau, Quebec.
As you heard in Justin's story, there are many skeptics about the government's plan. One of those skeptics is Russ Taibo. He was a candidate for National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. During the election, he ran a campaign that focused on the government's rights framework. He's joining us from Ottawa. Russ, thanks for joining us. You just came from the AFM Forum on First Nations rights, title, and jurisdiction. What's your take on what the minister had to say this morning?
Well, I listened to the minister's speech carefully, and it seemed to be more of a public relations speech than anything, because it bore no resemblance to the overview document that was released by the federal government today. And actually, one of the delegates got up and pointed that out to the minister.
Yeah, Russ, you've been sounding the alarm on this proposed recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights framework for months now, if not longer. And today, as you mentioned, we've seen a growing number of people share that concern. What do you make of the growing resistance within the AFN to the framework?
Well, you know, I think it's becoming clear. There has been a process going on where they have an Indigenous lawyers expert group that has been involved in discussions, I guess, in drafting the engagement document, which is supposed to frame what the legislation will contain. And they're starting to raise concerns now. I've seen comments from Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, you know, showing her concern, and there's that letter that went, you know, to the Prime Minister from several Indigenous lawyers. So I take their views as much softer than mine, and when I see them raising the alarm, it validates a lot of what I've been saying, I think. When you have all these lawyers lining up saying, whoa, wait a minute, that you're not even recognizing existing laws with this proposed legislation.
Russ, Minister Bennett said explicitly today that this framework is not the 1969 white paper. What are your thoughts on her saying that?
I think technically she's right. It's not the 1969 white paper, but it definitely contains the tenets or the objectives in that 1969 white paper of changing the legal and political status of First Nations in a way that is very threatening. That's why I would still say it's a termination legislation, not recognition legislation, because they're still putting conditions and wanting First Nations to come before a committee to be to see if they meet the criteria for federal recognition of being a nation. They're even proposing, you know, them having the same rights as a natural person, which basically means a corporation. So they're looking, the nation-to-nation relationship that they're talking about is much different than what our peoples have talked about and what the treaties recognized.
Last week, Idle No More, the Truth Campaign, and Defenders of the Land, for which you're a spokesperson, issued a statement denouncing the framework, calling on grassroots people to begin mobilizing. And, you know, grassroots people aren't part of the consultation process, so what role can they play as this framework unfolds?
Well, I think we need to put a stop to it. That's what we've said. We've done a breakdown of the engagement document that's been out for a while. You know, they just released a new one, but the new one just contains more details. The framework is the same. So we've asked our elders to start a process of prayer when Parliament resumes on September 17th, and for us to start mobilizing our people. So we're planning on having some webinars and teach-ins and getting information out to our people to get them aware of this issue, because, you know, even though this process has been going on for quite a while, and certainly since the Prime Minister made his Valentine's Day speech, it's really being done in a top-down national engagement process, which is really deceptive because there's only certain people that have been invited. And so the process itself has been not inclusive and not transparent. So many people don't even know about this yet. Mm-hmm. And so I intend on making this point at some point during the forum that we're going to work outside of AFN to work with our grassroots peoples and mobilizing them to put a stop to this legislation and to demonstrate we're opposed to it. And we're going to call on Canadians who support us to help us on that as well. I'm hoping to see at least the NDP and the Green Party representatives in Parliament support our opposition to this legislation.
Well, Russ, lots to talk about on this legislation. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but I appreciate you taking some time for us here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
The Justice for Our Stolen Children camp in Regina is being dismantled. For nearly 200 days, the camp has been up on the grounds of the Saskatchewan legislature. Campers have been protesting racial injustice and the disproportionate number of Indigenous kids in care. Joining us now for more is Bobby Cameron, the chief of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. Chief Cameron, thanks for joining us. A judge ruled last week the Justice for Our Stolen Children camp must be dismantled. Police have been authorized to arrest people if they don't vacate. What do you make of this decision?
Well, obviously we did our best advocating and lobbying to highlight the need for serious change in the child welfare system and the justice system. And, we did everything we could so that the court would rule in our favor. Our people who had the teepee camp set up, because it was a peaceful protest. There was no violence. There was no anger. It was a protest so that one day we would see change for our First Nation children, our greatest asset in Indian country across Canada.
The camp was up for nearly 200 days. Portions of it are coming down today. Do you think their message was received, though? Well, they did get some feedback. They had a meeting with the Premier and some of the ministers. They listened. However, the court system said dismantle. It was rather disheartening and frustrating for us once again that justice system here in our region failed First Nation people, because the underlying issue is still the same. We want to make positive change, immediate change in the child welfare system and the justice system. It is failing First Nation people right across Canada. And sooner or later, we have to do our best to have that collective voice where we are saying we have to and we must invest in education and rehabilitation rather than incarceration. In the long term, it benefits everybody economically, socially, mentally, politically, spiritually. Chief Cameron, the FSIN has pointed out some of the emails you've been receiving, including one under the subject line "Savages" and calling for yourself and others to be jailed. What does this all say about relations in Saskatchewan right now?
Well, it says that the attitudes and the false misconceptions from non-First Nation people to First Nations people is still alive and well. We hear the term KKK, Ku Klux Klan, that they're still in existence here in Saskatchewan and many parts across this country. People just don't want to talk about it. That being said, none of these children, whether they're white, black, red, yellow, or brown, we're not born with the feelings of hate and anger. It's a learned behavior from parents and grandparents taught to their children. Like, who wants to teach their children to hate people for the skin color? Pretty sickening.
Indeed. Chief Cameron, we're going to have to leave it there, but appreciate you taking some time for us here today.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
It's day 2 of hearings for the National Inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Iqaluit. We'll check in there next.
That and more coming up, but first, here's a look at Wednesday's weather forecast. To the east coast, we have rain in St. John's, 24 and rain in Halifax. To northern Quebec, 8 in Inukjuak with some rain, La Grande River, 19 in rain. In southern Quebec, Rouyn-Noranda, 25 and lots of sunshine. Chibougamau, 25 and sunshine as well. Southern Ontario, we got 23 and some rain. In Toronto, 19 and cloudy in Ottawa. Big Trout Lake, mix of sun and cloud and 12. Elliott Lake, sunny and 24. 7 and sunny in Churchill. God's Lake is sunny and 13. Winnipeg, cloud 19. Brandon, 29 and sunny. 12 in Saskatoon with some rain. 16 and some rain in Regina. Uranium City, 4 and sunshine. Stony Rapids, 7 and sunshine. Welcome back. It's day 2 of the Iqaluit hearings for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Unlike the previous hearings, which focused on victims and their stories, these hearings are about the history. Our Kent Driscoll caught up with 2 of the Inuit women giving testimony to see what it meant to them. This is from Iqaluit.
One of the stated goals of the inquiry is education, and that's what's been going on here today. Delegates have been receiving knowledge from local experts. Nunavut's challenges are always different than the rest of the country, but the women who are presenting here see some value in sharing it.
A good avenue to talk about it more publicly, because we always try and get this out to as many as people as possible. So
putting it on the national stage for sure. It's definitely intense, especially just having finished that cross-examination.
They may be here to teach and answer questions, but the delegates see value here.
As heavy as it is, it's important, and that to continue to talk about it. Sometimes it may be uncomfortable, but you still have to hear it nonetheless.
One of the documents under heavy discussion here is the report of the Kikitani Truth Commission. It was released in 2013, and it studied the historical conditions for Inuit here on Baffin Island between 1950 and 1975. Now, Commissioner Kayak Robinson was born here and raised here in Nunavut. She explained to the delegates why she thinks it's important that we get that information on the record in this inquiry.
It's a tremendous wealth of information, and the government, capital G, may not acknowledge it, but agencies, departments that are providing services in the North could gain so much knowledge and do such a better job with that knowledge.
If you came here to Iqaluit to learn about individual cases of missing Indigenous women, that hasn't happened. What is happening is the inquiry is gathering some context to help bolster their eventual recommendations. They're looking back to try and look forward. We'll know the value of the lessons that they've learned come April 2019, when they release their eventual recommendations. Ken Driscoll, APTN National News, Iqaluit.
Now, here's some more from today's testimony at the National Inquiry in Iqaluit.
It's so very important that funds are available to all of the territory in order for us to gain our dignity and to continue healing. It has started, but it's just come a very short way yet. There's a lot of work to be done to all the damage that has been done in the last 50 years.
An independent inquiry, while it's ideal, we think it's important that the RCMP do an internal investigation to look at themselves and how they treated Indigenous peoples.
The Quebec Inquiry Commission is in its second week of public hearings in Quebec City. The Commission is looking into the relationship between some government agencies and Indigenous peoples across the province. This morning, Marlene Gallagher, the interim executive director of North Coast Health and Social Services Centre, appeared before the Commission to speak about youth protection. Her area of jurisdiction covers 1,300 kilometres, 40 municipalities, 8 Innu communities, 1 Naskapi with 4 languages spoken. Gallagher says her challenges are enormously complex, and she says when it comes to First Nations, one has to understand the whole history of residential schools.
There is a history there that we have to take into account, and with each parent, we have to take the time to explain. But sometimes the first intervention will explain it, but when we get involved in the lives of parents, they often react. They're defensive. We can understand that sometimes for First Nations parents, they're twice more on the defensive because of history.
Well, tonight is the night many have been waiting for, the debut of First Contact on APTN.
Coming up after the break, we'll have a sneak peek at one of the special editions of In Focus that will air featuring the producers of First Contact. To northern Alberta, we have 5 in Submarine and high level, 3 in Fort McMurray with some rain. Southern Alberta, we got 6 in Edmonton, 16, and rain in Lethbridge. To southern BC, Campbell River, we've got 17 and some rain, 16 in Vancouver and Victoria with lots of clouds. Dease Lake 9, 26 in Fort St. John, Sandspit 16. Old Crow 8, Dawson City 12 and some sun and some rain. 8 in Norman Wells and Fort Simpson and Big Trout Lake and sun. Tuck is in at 1 and some sunshine. Deline 6 and a mix of sun and cloud. Baker Lake is in at 3 with a mix of sun and cloud. Whale 4, a mix of sun and cloud, and 4. Arctic Bay rain and 3, and Iqaluit 3 with a mix of sun and cloud. Tonight, the much-anticipated show First Contact appears on APTN. It follows 6 Canadians on a 28-day journey that challenges their perceptions of Indigenous people. The trailer for the show quickly reached over 2 million views and got people talking about the discrimination and stereotypes perpetuated about First Peoples in this country. Immediately following tomorrow night's episode, we are going to have a special presentation of In Focus, where I sit down with the hosts and producers from First Contact. Here's a sneak peek. First off, how would you even find people willing to go on national TV to share their ignorant or racist views of Indigenous people? Well, it's easier than you might think.
Well, we posted online and hundreds of people applied, like hundreds, so that's not a small number. And there were questions that spoke specifically about Indigenous peoples, and you'd be surprised how readily available people are to spew that kind of hatred. And it's unfortunate, but it's happening in Canada, and I think that that's one of the things that the executive producers thought originally, like, are we going to be able to do this? Well, we have people coming forward, and we did.
Bernadette Smith of Winnipeg's Drag the Red, which looks for bodies of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in the same river Tina Fontaine's body was found, had this to say about participants she met during filming.
You know, we're asking, you know, there's 1,200 missing and murdered women. Why are you only looking for...
Did they know that? Did you find that people did they know that figure, or were you informing them of this?
They had no idea about this figure. They didn't even know that this was a huge issue in Manitoba. And those numbers didn't seem really alarming for them, to tell you the truth. I had to actually equate it to non-Indigenous people. Right. So it was like 1,200 Indigenous women versus 18,000 Caucasian women. That's a high number.
While there's been no shortage of buzz about the show, some questioned why we'd air a show about ignorant Canadians. But the overwhelmingly positive reactions prompted this from producer Vanessa Lowen.
You know, that's those moments where you feel like that sickness that we maybe had in our stomach is gone. Like, you just realize we're reaching people, and that's all we ever wanted to do, and we're doing it. And it's pretty unprecedented from what we're hearing for a show, an original Canadian show like this with no existing audience, to just be taking off like this. And that tells us that we were ready. This country was ready for this discussion.
That special In Focus airs tomorrow, right after the second episode of First Contact. The series begins tonight, so check your local listings for showtimes.
Very excited to see the show and those special episodes of In Focus.
Lots of good stuff in there, lots of dialogue to happen after that, I'm sure.
That is your APTN News for this Tuesday. I'm Dennis Ward.
I'm Melissa Ridgen, and we'll see you back here tomorrow. Good night.